Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Kerri Arsenault, presenting her new memoir, Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains, in conversation with Lacy Crawford. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. We're hosting 5 events a week right here on Zoom. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com. And you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Milltown on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over these last few months, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. And thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm honored to introduce tonight's speakers. Kerri Arsenault is a book critic and book editor at Orion Magazine and a contributing editor at the Literary Hub. She received her MFA from the New School and studied in the master's program in communication for development at Malmö University in Sweden. Her writing has appeared in the Boston Globe, Literary Hub, Airmail, Freeman's, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and Orion. Lacy Crawford is an author of fiction and nonfiction, including the satirical novel Early Decision and the acclaimed memoir Notes on a Silencing. Her literary journalism includes profiles of Frank Conroy, Reynolds Price, and Shirley Hazard. Tonight, they'll be discussing Kerri's new memoir, Milltown, in which she unravels the complex and corrosive legacy of the paper mill that employed generations of her family and neighbors in Mexico, Maine, and sickened them and their environment to a degree that earned Mexico the nickname of Cancer Valley. With ferocity and grace, she tells the story of the financial, emotional, and physical wreckage wrought by industry's boom and bust in the lives of America's working class. Rachel Louise Snyder says, Kerri Arsenault has managed a literary hat trick, combining humanity, science, and capitalism, and the price paid not only by her own family in a single state, but across generations, industries, and geographies. In this, she has managed to create at once both a cautionary tale and a literary treasure. And Robert McFarlane calls Milltown the book of a lifetime, a deep drilling, quick moving, heartbreaking story. This is a book about residues and legacies, and I know that Milltown will stay with me for years to come. So now I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Kerri and Lacy.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
I know, that was really nice. Thank you.
Those are some pretty amazing introductions, and they make my job easier. I was struck by what Rachel Louise Snyder said. She's the author, of course, of No Visible Bruises, and she gave herself the impossible task of determining what policy changes could keep women alive in the face of domestic violence, and in doing so tried to unravel some of the impossible knots that are not dissimilar to some of the impossible knots that you have tried to unravel with Milltown, which is, we know this is a problem, but it seems over and over again to be a uniquely private problem rather than something that we can all address together, which is namely the cancer rates in these towns that are fed by and supported by and polluted by the mill. What she said about your book being a literary hat trick speaks to your tone, which is unique. And I would love it if you could read a little bit for those people who are here who haven't had the chance to read the book yet, and we'll start it tonight, I'm sure, just so that we can have your voice and go from there.
Thanks, Lace. I'm just going to read literally 2 paragraphs here. So, and I'll do it. This is really at the beginning of the book, page 8. I'm just talking about what it was like growing up there. And this is sort of near the end of that chapter. While my father walked back and forth across the mill footbridge to and from work, my mother lugged laundry up and down the cellar stairs, day after day, one skinny arm cradling the laundry basket, her free hand gripping a Vantage, a cigarette brand. whose packet featured a bullseye graphic design. With a screech and a whack, the screen door would slam shut after she elbowed it open. She would dump clean laundry on the kitchen table, snap each article of clothing 3 times, fold them sharply into tight wedges of fabric, and stack them like the reams of white paper my father brought home from the mill. When the screen door wore out, my mother replaced it with a new one that already came equipped with a squeaky spring. She left it defective, announcing herself into infinity with only my father to hear. His hearing, long dulled by the hum of paper machines, was the perfect match to her perpetual clamor. My mother, she'd let her Vantage expire before finishing it and send me to fetch her a new pack from the corner store. "I'll time you," she'd say. "Now go." And off I went. She didn't need to tell me twice. Things stayed in this balance with minor adjustments every now and then until America's working class towns started to ebb alongside the industries that nourished them. The future? We knew nothing of it. Our horizon trembled like a fragile convex meniscus, brimming away from the landscape that held it. All of what was before us was not as bright as what had passed.
Thank you.
That's it.
What had passed? What was the brightness that had passed?
Well, the brightness that I thought had passed, I guess. It's a complex question. I mean, I grew up in this town. I had a great childhood. I had wonderful parents. My mother is still alive and wonderful. She just sent me a picture of herself with a face mask with the my book cover on it. Like she's
a fan.
She's a fan. She's a good parent. You know, we had a happy childhood. There were dozens and dozens of children playing in the backyard of this town, you know, big Catholic families. I was friends with 2 families. One was like the youngest of 13 and the other was 15 kids. And she was the 3rd youngest. It was like teams of children. So because of that, you know, and that was the 70s growing up, I should say. But there was this idea that, you know, it was as my mother calls it in the book, happy days in a way. I mean, that was her generation, happy days, but it really carried through to my childhood too, because nothing really changed that much in our town that I saw as a child anyway. So what had passed was something I thought it was, but now as an adult and being away from it, I can see what had passed, and not all was happy days. Not for my parents, not for their parents, and not for my grandparents.
I might ask you to read that Happy Days passage in a little bit, but for now, the process of investigating what the sadness was that followed, how many people were getting sick. You know, I think if there are sort of 2 central questions to your book, it's who did this, and why did we let them do it, right? Who did this to us, and why? You approach this not as an environmental scientist, not as a pure memoirist, but those are the 2 modes of authority that we have been taught to understand when someone approaches a project this complex in book form. The way you approach it is as a person who's returning to the small town where she grew up, with what I think of as authenticity rather than authority. So you don't know the answers, not even at the end, really. Do you have?
I didn't even know the questions.
Clear, well, right. So it's not that you lead us through an argument that's been however carefully and beautifully narrated, but rather what you lead us through is the impossibility of the process, right? How it is virtually impossible for any single individual to understand and to counteract these systemic issues. The book has been said to meander like the river. How's it pronounced? The Androscoggin?
Androscoggin, yeah.
Which of course has a few fish in it now. Are they back? Unclear.
I mean, apparently you can eat 1 fish a year from it, but
I wouldn't.
But
right.
not I.
Right. So what was your understanding? This is your first published book. What was your understanding of how you were approaching this project, of what kind of book it might become, how you might shape it? Did you have any models for it? How did you not drown in it? How did you pull this off?
I did. I actually did look to the river. It's going to sound corny, but I did look to the river because the river I had a lot of information coming at me, and I hadn't been, I got my MFA, but that's an MFA. That's not a master's. They don't teach you how to like organize research or do anything. So I had a lot of stuff coming at me from everywhere, you know, moldy milk crates full of documents and like articles that people would send me and books I would just order by the dozens on, you know, online. And so I was trying to, you know, at first I categorized them. I'm like, this is about the pollution, this is about my family, and this is about the corrupt government, or these are about regulations or whatever. And I was categorizing them and they were all coming at me and it didn't make sense. I couldn't connect. I couldn't, there's a passage in there about me trying to organize it. I did, you know, charts and graphs and I put things on the floor and note cards. I tried to do it so many ways. But what happened was when I started putting it actually in chronological order, the family document next to the EPA document, then the story started to like, you know, shimmer a little bit. I'm like, oh, okay, this is what my family was doing. This is when this EPA rule had occurred. Do you know what I mean? So then it really started to make a lot more sense about, that's when I looked back and said, okay, maybe it wasn't such a happy childhood, or maybe it wasn't such a great place to live, when I started to see how that chronologically put together. And like a river, you know, moving forward always, but going off down tributaries. You know, my book has many lines that I follow, you know, the family lines, the economic lines of the working class. But I also think, you said, you know, I come into it not as an expert, and that's true. And I also just want to clarify too, I feel like there wasn't a story written about this, especially, you know, one thing, industrial America and how the Acadians and Franco-Americans were really the backbone of it. But there were also no narrative nonfiction or investigative memoir or whatever everybody else calls it, I don't know, from somebody from the working class. I mean, I consider myself from the working class, so I felt in it, you know, enough. So I'm looking at these documents, but at the same time, I'm going home and just being amid the people who live there and trying to understand from that point of view too what happens. So it's like a human point of view, not by asking them questions or interviewing them formally, but just like going to bars and going skiing and just being there. So that was part of the information too. So taking all of that and really lining it up on this sort of river, and the river is central to it's central to our town. The mill would have never been there if it weren't for the hydropower of the mill. River is what gives things life. You know, also the river became like this crazy metaphor. When my father got sick, you know, they had been pumping oxygen into our river for years to keep it, you know, something alive in it. And they had also been testing the oxygen levels. And that's what happened to my father too. So it was like literally the two things they were, so yeah. So the river also is something that, and like this information I was collecting, it would collect and collected and collected like a river does as it goes downstream and eventually goes into the Atlantic Ocean, our river does. And that's what happens with a lot of the pollutants in our river. You know, they're not provincial. They don't stay where we put them, you know. I mean, look up at the white sky right now.
Yeah, that's courtesy my neck of the woods. I apologize for that. But I can, in my understanding of the pure narrative of the book is that it kicks off with your grandfather's death. Yeah. Right. And with a conversation you have with some of the people. So you grew up in Mexico, Maine, which shared with Rumford, which I always want to think of as Rumsfeld because it has a similar sort of connotation of not knowing what you don't know. Rumford, you know, this mill, this extraordinary paper mill, which was founded in what, 1903 or something? Yeah. 1901. Okay. By this enterprising young American named, you know, Hugh Chisholm, as of course he would be named, Hugh Chisholm, and planned with a great deal of foresight, right? There was a town built because he knew he would have to have workers in the middle of the pine forest, and there's nothing else there, right? So it's almost like a kind of Levittown sort of, but designed for an industrial age. And as I was reading along, as you are digging to try to figure out, first of all, who your people are, you know, in addition to being from Mexico, Maine, and returning, I think you married fairly young, and then your husband was in the Coast Guard. So you had moved and moved and moved and moved. And most people, it sounds like, didn't leave. You know, it sounds,
Right.
you go back to these wonderful scenes where you go back to the grocery store with your mom and she says, look, Carrie. And you're like, oh, I don't know, you know, and do you remember her? And you're
Everybody
like,
does that, right?
right. You know, I mean, all of us can relate to that feeling. But I think what was remarkable to me was reading you researching the history of French Canadians in New England. And you give us a couple of data points about it. So between 1840 and 1930, almost 1 million French-speaking Canadians immigrated to the US, mostly to New England, to work in the textile and paper mills, right? And so if we compare this to the US population across that 90-year period, it grew from 17 million to 123 million, which means that over that period of time, these Acadians, these French-speaking Canadians, were a not insignificant percentage of the young United States population. I knew nothing about this. I had recognized the word, and I remembered in some of Elizabeth Strout's fiction that there are characters with French last names. Right. And I thought, that's odd. And there's a slight social valence associated with their French last name in some of her stories. And I didn't understand what that was. And as I kept reading, you know, you described the KKK in New England addressing the problem of the Acadians. So yet another enormous chapter of American history that my history classes left out. And I was reading one of the great, you know, which is to say infamous stories of immigrant panic in American history. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what you learned, because I think it's not commonly known, or at least certainly wasn't for me.
Yeah, well, you summed up part of it anyway. And it wasn't commonly known to me. And I grew up in a town that had so many Acadian and French-speaking Canadian families. So like Lacy said, it was interesting because they came on foot. You know, that's the big difference too. They didn't come through Ellis Island, or, I mean, you know, they didn't come on a ship. They came on foot. You know, I think there was some genealogist I was talking to, they compared it to sort of migration from Mexico now, you know, the same kind of thing. They're just kind of slowly coming over economically to trying to make a better living. So if you can compare it to that, and they did that, and that was, you know, the late 1800s. But before that, you know, I started going, I really wanted to understand the sort of groundwork of my family. I think it's important for us to know the foundations of what our lives are built on. And this is a real big part of this book, is not just looking at this mill town, but like the foundation of me and people like me. So I went further back, and I went to Prince Edward Island, and then I even went back to France to the 1500s. But back Prince Edward Island in 1755, when, you know, I found that, and I didn't really even know this until I started researching the book. So you find it out alongside me in the book in present tense, as I find out that the Acadians were ethnically cleansed from their land in the maritime provinces, and, you know, put on ships and sent away and killed and separated from their families, and their houses were burned by the British.
And they were ethnically cleansed by the British, right?
The British, with help from their New England neighbors too.
Help, of course. I think that would be their stock in trade. And the French Canadians were, you describe them as coexisting with the indigenous communities in a way that has not been replicated, certainly.
Not been replicated, and not anything I've read about before. And it's not to say, I'm sure there were problems. I mean, but what's been recorded and what's known is, yeah, they coexisted. They depended on them, really, especially the first few years they were there, and then, you know, ended up having children with them, and some marrying them. And and then when the British, of course, ethnically cleansed the Acadians, they shoved, you know, the Micmacs, it was the Micmac, they, you know, shoved them in the corners too of their own nation. But a lot of my family, so they weren't, the Arsenault, at least the Arsenault part of the family, hid in the woods in Prince Edward Island. They hid there, and they ended up repopulating up there. So I found that really interesting too. And they're the ones, there are a lot of them. I mean, there's French Canadian and Acadian on both sides of my family, I should say. And in fact, so much so that I followed it all the way back to my mother and father came from this town of like 200 people in France, and they're related. They're like cousins. But they hid in the woods 1755, so 1800s or whatever. And then, another 100 years later, then they came down to Maine, those people, to work in the mills. There's a lot of reasons they did, economics is one of them. For land, they had a lot of children. There's just a lot of different reasons that I go into in the book, but, it was mainly economic. They're offering really good wages in the paper mills. How could they refuse, And everybody was leaving Canada, I think I say, and my great-grandfather was a shoemaker. So I was like, so are their shoes. Their shoes are leaving. What's he gonna do? You gotta go.
You did write that. So for me, growing up outside of Chicago in the same years that you were growing up, Prince Edward Island to me was Anne of Green Gables. Right? I mean, that is the extension of, anything that I might have been aware of. And so here's your family hiding in the woods, which is like, something out of Central Europe in the Second World War, right? And then ending up working at the mill. And remarkably, what Chisholm's Mill, which has been owned by how many different conglomerates in the but it was Boise Cascade for most of the time that you were growing up that owned this mill, was famous for making coated magazine paper. So this is the paper, they produced it for the Sears catalogs and for glossy magazines. So the paper on which the American dream was literally sold. Right? I mean, as I said to you earlier, I think with the exception of Hollywood, there is no other vehicle so pervasive of the American dream, marketing the American dream, than this coated paper. It was the National Geographic, right? It was the Sears catalog. And this was your people. This was your
paper.
your people doing this. And at what cost? I mean, tell us a bit about the cost. What did it look like in the mill, the bleach room, the dangers? What was the gears? It's like, yeah.
Yeah. No, I should say, I have to tell you this too. I mean, I don't know about you, but probably a lot of people out there, we get that Sears catalog, and this is like so insidious now they think about it now. You brought the Sears catalog. I didn't even think about this, but every Christmas I'd get that thing and just circle everything.
Yeah.
I would get like nothing, or maybe one or two things, but like circle. I'd get like corduroys, Anyway, so what was happening is up until 1997, when paper is bleached white, it makes one of the most dangerous byproducts known to humankind, and it's the family of dioxins, I guess. So I'll just say dioxin. It's a complicated thing. The footnote of my book is like a page long, so I'm just going to say dioxins. It is bioaccumulative, and it is persistent in the environment, and it basically is in everybody's DNA currently right now, and it can do really horrible things to our bodies. Like, I'm just going to rip off a quick list so you know. It can damage immune systems, interfere with hormones. It can give you liver damage, accelerate female development, overall harm to unborn fetuses, suppress immune systems, advance other cancers. And there's no, it goes on and on, development and cognition. And there's no, at one point the EPA said there was no known safe amount. So like even in the smallest particle you can imagine, which I don't even know what that looks like. I can't imagine. It is dangerous. So in the paper mill, they were making bleaching paper, and this byproduct was created. It's not a product it was used in Agent Orange, I should mention too. That was the dangerous part of Agent Orange, and found in Love Canal. Up until 1997, they used elemental chlorine to bleach the paper, and then that changed. And in 1997, our mill used a different kind of chlorinated product. It still makes dioxin to this day, just not as much. So when that was happening, my grandfather worked in the bleach room. And what was interesting that I found out in my research too, is that I talked to a woman who had worked in the human resources department. She probably maybe could have worked when my grandfather was there. But she said that they would put the older men to work in the bleach room, which is what my grandfather was at the time. They would put them in the bleach room because they kind of knew that they would not live long after they worked there. And then they wouldn't have to pay out, all their benefits per se or whatever. She's like, they didn't say this, but she's like, I figured it out. That's her. She's since died of cancer too. And my grandfather died of cancer.
He died a few years after he retired, right? From the bleach room?
Yeah, exactly what she said. And I was like, what? So that's how my researching, it started my genealogy research, and then it ended up researching this, these toxics. So you can see how they were parallel, but then they cross, and they cross at many points, and they cross in my book at many points, because not more than a few people died in my book while I was writing it.
Most people died.
Most people died.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's not like if they're going to answer, it's like when.
Yeah. So, and centrally your father. So your father falls ill in the course of this research.
Yeah. So yeah, 2013.
2013 and dies the day after Christmas 2014, during which time you're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and supporting your mom and trying to figure out. And he had, what was it initially? Possibly esophageal cancer, possibly.
Well, he originally had asbestosis. He had been getting monies for a settlement for years, like $50 a year, $200, those kind of
That'll
things.
help. Yeah.
Yeah. That'll help. So he got like money like that, and then it petered out. He didn't really get much money after that. But the asbestosis can turn, my research can turn into lung cancer, or it can turn into mesothelioma is a whole different, well, it's not a whole different, it's also caused by asbestos. But anyway, I don't know enough, I'm not a doctor, but yeah, asbestosis can turn into lung or esophageal cancer. And he died of complications from that.
And when you saw him, one of the last times he was alive, your mother said maybe after he was gone, you could write about this, or you could get, or maybe after he got better, he could get some payout for his lung cancer, if I'm remembering right. And he said, I don't have lung cancer.
Oh, we were watching TV one night, and those ads come on, they're like, don't,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever that guy is that does that.
The ambulance chasers, yeah.
Yeah, and then they said something like, you too can get paid out.
Right.
And my mother was like, oh, hey, we should call.
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't have lung cancer. Like, when my father was diagnosed, he didn't want to know his prognosis. I think he feared the worst, I think he was just like, let me just live it out without just living in fear, which I thought was pretty noble in a way. It's like, let me just be ignorant, and this will happen. And he knew it wasn't good,
So he dies just before the middle of the book,
right,
as it's written. And when I got to that, I thought, because I know the kind of writer you are, we're going to shift gears here. Something is about to pick up, right? Something is about to pick up. And what is that thing? How is she going to hold this? Because she's put this here, and we're grieving, and he can't be buried right away because it's too cold and the ground is frozen. There's just this endless hardness. And you write, I do know I no longer have to keep secrets from him or for him. So would it have felt disloyal to you to research or write this book while your father, who was a pipe fitter at the mill for 40 years and never complained while he was alive, what, if anything, opened up or closed down for you when he died in the middle of this project?
Interesting question. I think, first of all, he would have been really proud of this. Like, he would be walking with this book in his back pocket and showing everybody. For one thing, whether he read it or not, I don't know. But no, I'm kidding. It's funny because just the other day, and I didn't know, it opened up, and that I felt like I could it could all come out. I didn't have to worry about hurting his feelings or letting him know his prognosis, or, there was things, I read parts of this to him while I was writing it. I started this in 2009. He was sick in 2013. I was in grad school in 2013 and 14. So I was working on this full force, and I read parts of it, just like the funny parts. And it is funny, people. I just want people to know there's some funny parts in here.
A lot of it is funny.
A lot of it is funny, weirdly.
It's very funny, yeah.
So, but what I was going to say is, it allowed me to just to talk about that stuff without worrying about him feeling like bad about his choice or about what he did for a living. It would have I think it would have felt really bad to like say, here's what you did. Look at all this damage of the environment or something. I mean, that could be how
Oh, interesting that he would feel complicit in.
who
Okay.
knows? But here's a really interesting thing. Subsequently, I've talked to more than a few people in my that I grew up with, and one woman, her father worked with my father, and he has been in touch, and he is reading the book right now currently, and he's not saying that. He's actually contributed to this other project that I started, but we can talk about that later if we have time. But I feel good, like I feel like that he read it and he's okay with it, that my father would have been, you know, or men like him.
But what was the experience that Doc Martin had? Doc Martin is a character who shows up very briefly in the beginning of the book, who had been a town physician for a long time and had noticed that the prevalence of highly unusual cancers like, you know, aplastic anemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, certain pediatric cancers was much, much higher than it should be anywhere else. And sure enough, the data seems to bear that out, at least in a generalized sense. What has come of efforts to bring this to people's attention locally or statewide or beyond?
Nothing. I mean, in the it was in the 1990s, there was a group, the Northern Oxford County Coalition. They studied this, and like you said, they're the ones that found the data that bore some of this out. But science is inconclusive, you know. This, like you said, it's nearly impossible to connect, you know, environmental toxics to like somebody dying of cancer. It's really impossible. The amount of, you'd have to have like a monitor embedded in your heart or something when you're born to like, and maybe even then not, because sometimes it's just genetic or something. I don't even know what that means, but yeah, nothing was ever really, after that study was done, and it took a few years and a lot of frustration, and I have all the poundage of document that they use. Nothing was conclusive, and then people just gave up. I mean, I think the largest group of people gave up. There were some people that still natter away at it here and there, but it's so big, and it's, you know, as I write in the book, who the hell has time to do this? I spent 10 years on this. I didn't even feel like I touched the surface in some ways, you know. Never mind if I had to like work 7 to 3 or feed my kids, and I don't know. I mean, all the things that working class people have to do. And in this town, it's a lot now. I mean, it's, you know, 4 to 5 or 3 out of 4 kids are food insecure in our town. There's the opioid crisis. There's mass unemployment. There's no infrastructure there. There's no transportation. So you have to work if you don't have a car, you have to work at a job close by. So anyway, on and on, you know. I don't even know what I was talking about.
Is the demise of the mill, I mean, so the
mill's
mill
still operating.
The mill's still operating, but it's significantly decreased in its employment levels, right? And which is one reason why, because I don't think those levels of childhood hunger, they don't appear in your recollections of your childhood.
No, I mean, it was just occasionally some, but it seemed like the town sort of lifted those people up a lot more. But if the larger percentage is that way, how does that, it's so out of balance. It's out of balance like most everything in this country, you know?
Right. And yet this isn't a story of sort of the poor worker bees, you know, who aren't given clarity about what is going on. There was real awareness of how dangerous this work was, right? And in fact, a memorial to workers who had died on the job, no memorial to workers who have died off the job, because nobody wants to make that connection, right? So I mean, this is an oversimplistic question, but the answer is really interesting. Why did people remain so loyal to a place that was so clearly, I mean, you say, and it's very funny that your whole town smelled like farts, and the other kids would come in to play soccer from the other schools, and they were like, oh my God, you know, like this was just something you were familiar with, and the gray bubbles that float down, you know, the dead river. This was not a secret to anyone.
Yeah, I know.
Why stay silent, therefore? Why stay loyal?
I mean, the answers are as enormous as this book, but I can say a few things. We had this talk when I did my book launch, and there were a lot of people there from my hometown, including my cousin, my sister, and we had like a little off Zoom room. And we talked about it, and people asked that of them. And we all sort of were like, it's complicated. I mean, it's their identity. You know, this job as a papermaker. If you look at a papermaker, like you look at a lobsterman, right? Everybody seems that it seems such like a thing. It's like this mythology. But a papermaker, there's kind of, but it's a real identity, and that's if you can closely align it with a lobsterman, that's what it feels like, right? So there's that aspect. But the other thing is, it was really good money, and it was a really good job, and it provided a lot of security for our families in our town. And what else was there if you didn't go to college? I mean, I was a first generation college student. It's nobody else in our family went to college or anything. So you're living in an isolated part of Maine. Your father, your grandfather worked there. This is my father, you know, 3 generations. You go to the service, you come back. What are you going to do? You know, you're going to work in the mill if they offer you a job. And, you know, the other part of it is it's also a human condition. As I found out, I looked at some studies where 80% of people, and no matter what their workplace, no matter what country even, if they saw something wrong in the workplace, they wouldn't say anything about it. They would remain silent. 80%. So it's not even just, it's like a human problem, you know, these silences, as you know, in your own book.
I'm gonna sidestep that one neatly. I was wondering this. There's a beautiful section where you talk about the repetitiveness of work in the mill, and this I think has increased. So it used to be, as you describe it, like with the lobster fishermen, that it was a guild, and not only that, but your father, who was a pipe fitter, was one of the few pipe fitters who would be on in his shift, and if a pipe needed fixing, they had to find him, or nothing went forward. And the same was true with the electricians, and I imagine the same was true in the bleach room, and the same was true with everybody. So these were not, you know, replaceable employees, you know, these skilled craftsmen who have a unique role to play.
Yeah,
right?
it's interesting you say that. And let me just stop for 1 second, because the mill, I should say, operates 24/7. So yes, you can't just like stop to fix something. It has to just keep moving. And if they need a part, somebody in the machine room makes it.
Makes
you know?
it.
Yeah.
Like a ship. It's like being on a ship. It is sort of a, like, we are at sea, and you're in the middle of the forest, right? And one of the things that sort of broke the back of the mill, as you described, was when Boise Cascade announced, I think to try to break a strike, right? That people were going to come back but serve in whatever capacity the mill dictated that day. So a pipe fitter could be sent to work anywhere else, which is a way of stripping people, you know, of their identity. And I wondered if something about the danger, which obviously everyone was aware of to some extent or another, I wondered if that counteracted to some extent the repetitiveness of it, or some of the indignities that were foisted upon them by corporate owners, that perhaps by being the ones who were brave enough, is it possible that it was construed as proof of character in a way?
Possible. I never thought about it, but it could be possible, knowing the character of the people there. I mean, but I also look at it as more like it wasn't exactly a choice to work
Right.
there in a lot of ways.
Right.
So less of a choice, you know. So once you get in, sure, then you can be like this tough person, but not so. I think that would come after the fact.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That makes sense.
It's really interesting to think about them. Huh.
So I wanted to talk about something that you arrive at toward the end of the book, which is that you realize that your project is not trying to understand who broke the rules or how the mill had broken the rules, because in fact, the mill appears to have helped to write the rules. Can you tell us a little bit about how it is possible that these chemicals were dumped everywhere and the land died and everybody saw it, and yet nobody was able to point to any proof that this needed to change or this could change?
I mean, I spent a lot of time in the, if you mean at the Maine DEP, looking through documents and talking about
the insane asylum?
The insane, it used to be the insane asylum.
Right.
And then before that, it was a like a fort. So all 3 things combined, it's like this weird hallowed ground of insanity. But you know, the EPA was found to be in collusion with industry and lobbyists in the 1980s, and it was Ann Gorsuch who was leading the EPA, which is Supreme Court Justice's mother. I just wanted to say that. there's been a long history of that. And, there were even things in the main DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection. There was a dioxin expert that quit because he was like, they're not listening to me. He's like, I would tell them, these are the rules, this is what's going to happen. And they were basically ignoring him. So he quit. And then come to find out, in the final nail in the coffin, literally, was the EPA had done years of dioxin studies, and they found in a draft study they published, they found that dioxin was indeed as carcinogenic as I've stated at the beginning of this discussion. But industry pressured them so much that they didn't publish that report, and they put it on a shelf, and they published, so instead of publishing the cancer risks associated with dioxin, they published the non-cancer risks. So they put that on a shelf, and there it sits. And I talked to, I don't know if I should say this, is that giving away the ending? Stephen Lester, who's a dioxin expert. He said if they published that report, it would be traumatic for the entire US economy, like immediately and devastatingly and irreversible.
Can you tell us about that? Like what industries, in what way?
Because it's in everything, dioxin's found in the fat of, animals and in their byproducts. And, even in a breastfeeding mother, it's 77% times the rate the EPA recommends. Breast milk has dioxin in it, but it's in like a hamburger. It's in every hamburger we eat. He put it this way. He said, you eat a hamburger and it's carcinogenic, any hamburger.
So we are all of us trapped in the same way.
Sorry.
No, that we are all of us trapped in the same way that people.
That's what I mean. The river goes to the Atlantic Ocean, dumps in there.
Right.
We're all part of the ocean now.
Right.
Swimming in this dioxin ocean.
How has Mexico and the mill? It's now owned by a Chinese company, right? And you write about how paper making is now being offshored, along with every other industry that is leaving for utterly unregulated shores where workers can be treated. There's the consultant you talked to who said industry in the US functions like a colonial enterprise. So, your community was effectively colonized by its own nation to function in this capacity. And now not even the forests are being felled. You're right that the eucalyptus trees that they grow in South America for paper making are cloned. Right. So not only are the workers utterly replaceable, but the trees themselves lack any kind of intrinsic integrity, which is devastating. The notion to me of a cloned forest is one of the most depressing things I've thought of in ages.
That too, I know. He was like, you can't, even tree farms up there, even in Maine, if you do a tree farm, it's not the same thing as a forest growing.
Of course not. Yeah, because inorganic, right? It's a grid. So how has Mexico responded? Mexico, Maine, how has the mill responded? Tell us a little bit, if at all, and talk about the Cancer Yearbook.
Oh, you mean responded to my book?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Oh. They it's been surprisingly warm reception. I've heard from so many people who have started, they've emailed me. I put my email up for everybody to use. I don't care. Email me if you have a question or if you have something you want to talk about. And I got so many people emailing me their cancer stories. Oh yeah, this person, my mother, my grandfather, my sister, my brother, me, young people, old people, about their cancers. And, that was one kind of email I was getting. The other kind of email I was getting was like, I'm so glad you're telling this story because somebody needed to tell it. And I feel so seen, which is really like moving to me. I'm sure you know what that feels like with your book, to be seen, to be heard and seen. There's once in a while, there's a few people that are still in denial. They're like, I think I told you, is like this one guy said, I want to remember it this way. This is the way I prefer to remember it, this town. So even though your book's good, I prefer to remember it this way. So there's still that denial there, and that's part of that silence too. It's a little bit of denial. We all have to tell ourselves stories to live. If we don't, we will be paralyzed every day when we get up. Like if I think about what's going on in the world, I have to just say, okay, I'm going to be happy today. Otherwise you're paralyzed. And sometimes we are paralyzed, but so for him to want to believe that, I'm okay with that. But the reception has been really incredible. And so what came of this with all these people telling me about stories of cancer, I was like, I got to do something with this because it was going to paralyze me, first of all. So I started this cancer yearbook, meaning it's like a yearbook and it's on my website, but it's people telling people's stories, their photograph, their headshot, like a yearbook with their story about their cancer. And what I really hope I can do is just create a critical mass of people so that I can say, here's some evidence. Maybe it's not your scientific evidence, but here's like thousands of people in my town that have all these strange cancers and all these stories. And our town's not big. I mean, Mexico is like 2,000 people, and Rumford is, a few more thousand, but so I wanted that, and I wanted them to, I think it's important to put faces with data, and that's really what drove this book too, is to put faces to this thing. I read so many books about the working class and this and that, and it's like, but you're not really talking about people and humanizing them. They might talk about them as in they're like, they voted like this, or they're this political or this, but like, they're human people. They all want to like be safe and happy and have a home. And, people basically want the same thing. And I just thought putting their faces to this data is important.
With regard to the working class, it's unusual for a writer who is raised in the working class to be permitted to work as a writer. Yeah. For circumstances to align, for a writer to make writing her vocation. And I think some people are interested in how you found that course, how you sustained yourself. I should say that there is a brilliant essay that the New York Review of Books published called My 86 Jobs, right? This is the 87th published author, that has been a knockout with many of the reading communities that I'm a part of. And I recommend everyone go find it. But how did you sustain yourself, I suppose logistically, but also sort of emotionally over the long course of working on this?
On the book, or just like, I mean.
Well, I mean, answer as widely as you wish.
86 jobs. So that's how I became, everybody wants to know, how'd you become a writer? I worked 86 jobs. So that's what I did. I mean, I think I needed that perspective. I mean, that, and to be away to be able to see, I think writing requires perspective. Obviously, Lacy, you wrote your book how many years after?
30.
Yeah, so it requires perspective. At least I do. I don't know, some people write it in the thick of it. So 86 jobs, plus I hadn't written in like 30 years myself. I really hadn't until I went back to grad school on the GI Bill. So that, and emotionally, I don't know, I got 2 cats, and I went to grad school, and I took what my parents told me. It's like, work, put your nose to the grindstone and work. And that's what I've always done. And, I was like, okay, my father's sick, but this is what I have to do. And he would want me to. And, even though he was sick, it'd be like, I would bring my work home, and they would see me, I don't know, working hard, and just, they always said, if you work hard, you're going to be successful, which I think is a bit of baloney. The American dream really isn't really, it's like an American nightmare. I mean, I know that from 86 jobs and from seeing my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather get picked off by cancer and everything, and by the mill. But there is something about working hard that I can't seem to let go of. So that's what I did. I worked hard, and I exercised hard, and I got 2 kittens.
You've told me, and you've written also about how, because your husband was in the Coast Guard, and you've also said very candidly.
Yeah, I should say he financially sustained us.
Well, and you said your job was to do all the chores and not have children.
Right, yeah.
To make sure that you could sustain your lifestyle, because you did not grow up into the world, with any amount of savings to take with you, and with debts, to pay. So following that, you shared also that it was the GI Bill that permitted you to pursue an MFA,
Right.
which I hope is okay to share. What I find remarkable about that is that you had obviously the ambition that you have, the capacity that you have, the work ethic that you have, and nevertheless it was only by alignment with federal policy, which is in slim supply, right, that you were permitted sort of the open doors to something as rarefied as publishing.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder how you feel holding that when you go back in the grocery store. You know, the one who says, "Where do you live now?" as she's checking you out, and you say Connecticut, and she says, "Martha Stewart lives in Connecticut," you know, and you say, you know, not like I do, you know, something like that. I wonder how you hold that.
Well, sometimes honestly, it is hard. Not hard. I shouldn't say it's hard to go back, because it's not. I don't have a hard time, but it's awkward. I was just talking to another woman that I played softball with. We were texting, she was reading my book, and she's like, she called us, like, you know, Mexico refugees. And like, so going back to be successful, this is what she said, and I can agree with it to a point. If you go back and successful, you're bringing back all this other baggage that you sort of picked up along the way, and you feel very judged sometimes. But at the same time, I just spent 10 years there working on this book. I mean, some of those interactions happened, but as I think the more that I went back and the more I got to know people, I mean, I feel a very deep affection for the people there. Not everybody feels a deep affection for me, but some do, you know, and regardless of political affiliation or regardless of any, you know, thing, I think there are so many things that we found common enough so that I mean, I haven't been back in a while. My mother moved the day I finished this book. So
she did. I didn't know that.
Yeah, the day I turned my draft in, she moved to Freeport, Maine, and I haven't been back since. And it would be interesting to see. So I don't know what that's going to be like. I cannot predict. Now that the book's out too, especially. I don't know, I could have tomatoes thrown at me. I don't know.
There's a question about the management of the mill and whether the management lived locally too, and was there some sort of division on the ground or any interaction at all?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of management per se lived in the nicer houses, and they were literally lived up higher. It was like that kind of, you know, huge Chisholm built the houses. He built the banks. He built everything. He did build a wonderful brick park, though. It's called Strathglass Park, for the workers. And there were these buildings, and there were two houses connected, and he even furnished them and wallpapered them, and they were these beautiful houses. I mean, they're gone to hell in a handbasket now, but he did that for the mill workers. But of course the management lived higher up in the hill, and none of the owners ever lived in our town. It was very remote management, just like many corporations. You know, of course Hugh Chisholm was maybe kinder than most. He gave people turkeys at Christmas, and he did pull himself up by the bootstraps, but you know, he never lived in that town himself. He had an apartment on Fifth Avenue, New York City.
At what point in the mill's 120-year history do you think it became clear to its owners that it was poisoning its workers?
Day one.
They knew all along?
Well, I mean, back, you know, way back, you know, they thought the solution to pollution is dilution. You know, that was kind of that was the ongoing thing. But as early as the 1940s in our mill, the EPA didn't exist, but I can't remember what it was called, but there was an action taken against our mill and the Berlin paper mill and another mill because they had polluted our water so bad, people couldn't even breathe. And this was 1940, and they took an environmental action at that time, which was really kind of progressive for the time. People couldn't breathe. Coins were tarnishing in their pockets. People were like vomiting. It was really bad. So as early as that, you had, you know, 1940s. That's when my grandfather was working there in the bleach room, or early. Yeah. My father was born in 1933, so he must have been, I don't know. Yeah. I see another question here too.
Yeah, there's a question about the Acadians that came in a while ago, and I was going to ask you to answer it earlier, but we moved on.
Yes, the Acadians came from France before the British came to North America. Yes, they came in 1601. Why did they come? so they came basically the same reason most people came across the ocean. They were like, here's some land, we want to develop it. And here's what was interesting too. They were working on the waterways in France, in the Loire Valley and Loire River and all those rivers around there, which I went to too. And then when they came over to the maritime provinces too, they were also the watermen there, and they were like taming the seas up there. And then they come down to, Rumford in Mexico with our river going through. So they were watermen. I mean, not all of them, of course. They were just populating. They were starting settlement there. France had sent their people over, and they were like, I'll go. They wanted to not be like serfs anymore. They weren't educated, and they were working class back then. They're working class now. And were they distinct ethnic group? Yes, the Acadians, was this in the 1750s or so? Yes, they were a distinct ethnic group from the maritime provinces in Canada. And so they came in 1601 and 1755. I mean, it went back and forth, the British and the French, whatever was happening on the sort of, then the homeland was happening in the maritime provinces. So 1755 is when they finally jettisoned them out. I think that answered all those questions in that one question.
It did. I have one last question for you, because we're coming to the top of the hour, and if there are other questions, they can come in. But the mill was able to be as wildly successful as it was because of workers who didn't ask questions and who prided themselves on not having a sick day in 30 years and who had enough children to replace the workers who died young. And because of the forests in which they stood. So we think of Maine as vacation land, and differently that is a very carefully curated area for tourist dollars, and that everyone else is busy working that land. As with everything else in the country, it seems, and in the world, although I think the US is among the last to arrive at this realization, natural resources are a finite commodity, and there's only so much poison we can dump into the atmosphere or the river before it returns to us. I'm talking to you under yellow skies in Southern California. You had the same skies before the sun went down. As someone who has stared into the face of this, including the complexity of the fact that you had a happy childhood, you might have been the last generation, in Mexico, but you describe wonderful scenes of children who were in many ways safe, not in all ways certainly, and not in some critical ways, but safe and loved and belonged, truly belonged. You go back, you say, I'm Maddie's daughter, and doors open.
Yeah.
Nobody needs to know anything else.
Totally. Yeah.
That is not an experience that many of us still have, I think. And I do think that it forms part of a kind of national nostalgia, which at a certain end of the political spectrum is expressed as make America great again. That would not be my preferred phrasing. But I do think there is something to be said for a fantasy of an endless forest, right? Or an endlessly running river. And we've reached, that's right. That's right. The forest primeval, which wasn't even primeval, by the time that was, and so we've reached the end of that. And as a writer, as a person who grew up in these places, who loves these places, who has buried people in these places, what would you say to those of us who feel with you your despair? What do we do? I'm sorry, that's such a horrible, but help me, patch me back up before.
No, I mean it. I mean, I really think we need to vote for people who want us to live.
Not die. Check. That's one.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, they're making it's the regulations that they're making. When they say, oh, you can have this much dioxin in your body. No, you can't. Or if you're going to put a regulation on a shelf, and so that we can't see it, so the country doesn't freak out, who are these people? I mean, why are we voting for these leaders? I don't care what your political affiliation is. If you want to live, there's more of us than there are of them, meaning us, meaning the 99% or the people in power. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah, we can vote them out, whatever. We could just get rid of them if we so choose. If we could all band together. It's a very idealistic thing to say, but it's true. We need to vote because I don't know what else to do, really. I don't know, all of these problems boil down to leadership, I think, and what has been allowed to happen. I mean, I should also say there's a really great book by Kurt Anderson that just came out, and I did an event with him last night at City Lights called Evil Geniuses, and it runs completely parallel to mine, except for I was inside living this experience, and he was writing about how this sort of structural takeover of has happened. And it's really interesting to read the two in concert with each other. So read his book and then vote.
Well, read your book.
And then read my book first.
I
And
think
then Lacy's, which we haven't talked about.
I think you've done something remarkable with this, which is you've made us feel, those of us who could never have experienced an employment, a career, a community like that, you've made us feel the impossibility of speaking up against it, and also long for a lot of what was wonderful about it, and to mourn it with you, which is a complicated place to sit because it makes us all complicit, and indeed we are. So I know that your book was printed on unbleached paper. I'm sort of dreaming about getting the anti-vaxxers on board with dioxin. Like, you think the DTaP is bad, sister. Let me tell you a little bit about dioxin, right? Like, maybe we could harness this in some way.
Craziness, yes.
But I think I do also want to say that there is a raft of environmental literature out, fiction and nonfiction, and I sometimes approach it warily, and that your book is a companion through the investigation in a way that makes it okay and funny. It is funny, and you are wonderful to go along with, through this investigation. And so it's a real gift for those of us who are trying to find a way to relate to this moment without having a complete and total nervous breakdown all the time.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So thank you for that. And thank you for the chance to talk to you about your book.
I get a whole hour with you. It's such deliciousness.
Cheers.
Thank you, guys. I just want to thank you both for that incredible conversation. And I want to thank everyone watching for spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Milltown and Notes on the Silencing at harvard.com. It's got a gorgeous cover. I love the cover. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I just want to say have a good weekend. Keep reading and stay safe. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Kerri.
Thank you.
I'll see you soon, Lace, right? Okay. If anybody wants to email me, I should have said if anybody wants to email me, my email's on my website.
I should have. And Sarah posted the
Are they still here?
Review of books. Can they still hear us?
I'm ending, but yes, email Kerri.
Okay, email me.
On our website. Bye.